folks, JLand Bio here. We talked a little bit last time about the concepts of natural selection. So what we're going to really dive into today is the evidence for evolution. That is, how do we know that natural selection has taken place? And also, how do we take a look and explore how different organisms are related to one another? And how do we know how closely they're related to one another? So lots of different ways that we can look at this, and that's what we're going to dive into today. So by the end of this video, you should be able to understand what evidence is available to point towards natural selection as a mechanism for evolution. So we're going to be looking at the evidence today. And secondly, you should be able to use these mechanisms as a way to analyze how closely species are related and how they may evolve over time. So some key vocabulary terms for today: we're going to talk about fossils, homologous structures, analogous structures, vestigial structures, and embryology. So fossils are traces of organisms that have existed in the past. You probably know this already. And that helps us understand relationships between organisms that were once living but are no longer alive. So if we take a look here at fossils, and this is a good example of how we can determine age of species and relative ages to one another, is that if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that there's a diagram of all these different fossils, and you can take an assumption that the top part would be the newest soil, the newest dirt, closer to the surface, and that as you go down, typically the age of the fossil gets older. Now, if we see fossils that are in the same type of rock or close to one another, we can make a pretty fair assumption that they probably lived, at least at some point, during the same time period. And so you can see here that the little crab-like creature is only in the top layer, so its age is relatively young. Whereas if you see some of the other ones, like the little white whirly thingy, I don't know how else to describe it, they're found deeper under the surface. And so those individuals may have lived in a previous time, before the crab. Furthermore, we can look and see that there are shells, stars, and little clams in all of the different layers, so we can make a pretty safe assumption that they've lived during all of those different time periods. So this gives us an idea of how old certain organisms are, which organisms lived with other organisms, and comparatively speaking, which ones are older and which ones are younger. So it provides a really great tool for us to be able to understand how organisms have evolved and adapted over time. One of the key things that we look at is comparative anatomy, and there are several different types of structures we are going to take a look at, the first being homologous structures. These are structures that are similar in structure but may serve different functions. So if you take a look here, the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, this is like a Dr. Seuss movie. All of them have the same basic structure. They have a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Now you can see that in the cat, the whale, and the bat. All of them have a very similar structure. Now, each of them uses that appendage for a different purpose. Obviously, the hand is used for some, grabbing. The cat's paw is used for walking. Whales' flippers or fins are used for swimming, and then the bat's wing is used to fly. But all of them have the same basic structure. This points towards a common ancestor that they shared a long, long time ago. All of these different species evolved from that one common ancestor. So we look at anatomy to get us a better understanding of how organisms are related to one another. Another type of structure that we look at doesn't really help us with evolutionary perspective is analogous structures. And these are structures that have a similar function but do not share a similar structure. So for example, the shark fin, the penguin fin, and the dolphin fin all actually have very, very different structures. Now, even though they're used for the same purpose, it does not point to common ancestry because the bone structures are very different from one another. They've just evolved to live in the same environment. So even though they live in the same environment, they do not share a common ancestor because the bone structures are not homologous to one another. We also can look at vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures that were once used by a common ancestor but are no longer functional. That helps us understand common ancestry as well. So for example, in us, the tailbone. Lots and lots of mammals have other functional tailbones or tails. Humans do not. They still have the tailbone there, though, that again was once shared by a common ancestor. Additionally, the appendix is another example of this, as it doesn't serve much of a purpose in humans, but serves a distinct purpose in lots of other mammals. So vestigial structures play a very important role in helping us understand how organisms are related to one another. We can also look at embryology and how embryos develop over time. Embryology is the study of the development of life. Embryos that share similar characteristics typically are more closely related to one another. So if you take a look at all of the embryos in A, they all look pretty similar to one another. If you look at B, we see that the fish and the salamander look very different than the other ones. And when we look at C, you can see that there's some distinct differences between all of them. Two of them that are very closely related are the rabbit and the human. Well, both of those individuals are mammals, so they share a more recent common ancestor. The more closely they resemble one another, the more recent the common ancestor. Same thing with the homologous structures. The more similar the structures, the more recent the common ancestor. So hopefully you guys have a pretty good idea of kind of what's going on here. DNA, which is our word of the video as well, DNA, so make sure you write that down. The more similar the genetic material, the more closely the species are related to one another. So we can see here that humans share 98% of their DNA with chimpanzees. And that's not because humans are evolved from chimpanzees or anything like that. It just means that they share a more recent common ancestor than, say, humans and mice or humans and zebrafish. Okay? We'll explore a little more of this as we move on. But get the idea that there are lots of different ways, lots of different evidences that point towards evolution and natural selection. And extensive evidence points towards it as the mechanism for evolution. Genetics and comparative anatomy and embryology all point towards common ancestry and relatedness of species. So we look at all of these things to help us understand how species are related to one another, how recent their common ancestor is. All of the different things we're looking at help us understand natural selection and evolution. Have a great day, guys. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.